So we've gone through quadratics now, and so now we're going to look at complex numbers. So if you remember, whenever we were doing quadratics before, a lot of times we had a square root in the negative, or have a negative in the square root. So we'd have something like the square root of -1. So if we want to be able to solve every quadratic that's out there, we need to somehow define what is the square root of -1. So what we define this as is I. So I is the square root of -1. So it's a complex number, but I is the square root of -1. So what's important about that then is that I squared is -1, which is nice because if we want to rewrite some things like the square root of -4, well, I know that's the same as the square root of 4 times the square root of -1. What's the square root of 4? Remember, there are two of them. And the square root of -1 is I. So that's plus and minus 2I. What about the square root of -3? Again, I can split it up. 3 and -1. So I get the square root of 3I. And really we would say, plus or minus. There's two square roots of it. But because we have this I now, we can talk about the square root of negative numbers. So we're going to go through addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division of complex numbers. So what is a complex number? It's anything of the form a plus bi. So for example, 1 minus 2i, that's a complex number. 4i, that's a complex number. There's a 0 out front. It's really 0 plus 4i, but just 4i is a complex number. 2 minus just I, that's a complex number. 5 is a complex number. Now why is 5 a complex number? Because really, this is 5 plus 0i. So everything is a complex number. So anything you can think of, it's going to be a complex number, but in general, a plus bi. So a real number plus a real number times I. So first off, addition. So addition of two complex numbers, all you're going to do is add the real parts, add the complex parts. So for example, let's say that I do 3 minus 2i plus 5 plus 6i. So those are my two complex numbers, first, second. What I'm going to do is add my real parts. I'm going to circle those in red. The real parts are the 3 and the 5. So if you add those together, what do I get? You get 8. Now in green, I'm going to add my complex parts. So negative 2i plus 6i gives me 4i. So if I add those two complex numbers together, I get 8 plus 4i. Let's do one more of these. How about negative 4 minus 3i plus 10 minus I. So again, with complex numbers, I'm going to add my real parts. So negative 4 plus 10 is a 6. Then I'm going to add my imaginary parts. Negative 3 minus one more of them gives me negative 4i's. So that's addition. Addition is just adding your real parts, adding your complex parts, and writing them down. Same thing with subtraction. We're just going to subtract the real parts and subtract the imaginary parts. So let's start with 5 plus 3i minus 2 plus, how about 5i? So just like with addition, I'm going to first look at my real parts. But now instead of adding, I just subtract. So 5 minus 2 gives me 3. Now look at my imaginary parts. Instead of adding, I'm going to subtract. So I have 3i minus 5i gives me negative 2i. So all I did, subtract my real parts, subtract my imaginary parts, get the answer. Okay, how about 2 plus 8i minus negative 4 minus 2i. So I'm going to start with my real parts, and remember I'm subtracting, not adding. So I get 2 minus a negative 4. So you want to be careful here. I'm subtracting that negative 4, so I'm really adding. So I get a 6. So 2 minus a negative 4 gives me that 6. Next, look at my imaginary parts. So I have 8i minus a negative 2. Subtracting a negative means I'm adding. So I get 10i. So 6 plus 10i. So addition and subtraction. Look at the real parts, look at the imaginary parts, and then do whatever you have to do, the addition or the subtraction. Do one of them. Next, we got multiplication. So multiplication. You actually already know how to do this because we've done foiling or double distribution before. The key with multiplication, what you're going to need to remember, is what is I squared. We did this before, so maybe look back in your notes. I squared is negative 1. That's going to be key for multiplying two complex numbers. But all we're going to be doing is distribution. That's all we're doing. So how about 1 minus I times 3 plus 2I? If you want to think of this kind of as to the side, and I said multiply x plus 1 times x minus 2, what would you do? Well, you would distribute the x to both terms, then you distribute the 1 to both terms, and you would simplify. It's not any different. First thing I'm going to do is distribute this 1. So if I distribute that 1, I'll get 3 plus 2i. So far, so good. Now I'm going to distribute this negative I, so I get minus 3i. Now what's going to go for my last term? Negative I times 2i? Negative 2i squared. Okay, so really all we did, distribution. Everything's good so far. Now let's simplify. Can't do anything with that 3 yet. In the middle I got a 2i and a negative 3i. Well, that's just negative 1i, so negative I. Now let's look at this term. Remember, what did I say to the key? The key was here, I squared is negative 1. So that's the same as saying negative 2 times negative 1. That's really just a positive 2. So negative 2i squared, just a 2. So to simplify this one more step, I get 5 minus I. So really all I did here, double distribution, foiling it out, and remembering that I squared is negative 1. Let's do another multiplication here. How about 3 minus 2i times 4 plus 3i? So I'm going to double distribute again. First I'm going to go with the 3. So I'll get 12 plus 9i. Now what about this 2i, negative 2i? I'm going to get minus 8i, and then what, minus 6i squared from the first and the two last terms. So in the foiling, if you would do it, it would be the last term. Now let's simplify. So I got 9i minus 8i is positive I. And now what about this term? Remember, I squared is negative 1. So this is really negative 6 times negative 1, so that's just a 6. So I get 18 plus I. So that's multiplication. As long as you can distribute, you can multiply complex numbers. Just remember, I'm going to say this over and over again, I squared is negative 1. That's going to be crucial for multiplying. Also dividing. So let's talk about dividing. So dividing complex numbers. Remember that dividing, so if I say 1 divided by 2, that's really just 1 over 2. You know, division can be rewritten in vertical form, so that's going to be important to us. We also need to know what's the conjugate of a number. So the conjugate of a plus bi, and we put a line over it to mean conjugate, is a minus bi. So you just change that sign. So what's the conjugate of 2 plus I? Well, that would just be 2 minus I. What's the conjugate of 3 plus 3i? That would be 3 minus 3i. What's the conjugate of 3 minus 4i? Change the sign in the middle, so that's just 3 plus 4i. And then lastly, what about the conjugate of 2i? That would be negative 2i. So all we're doing is flipping the sign on the complex part. So the conjugate is where you just flip the sign on the complex part. Okay, so now that we know that dividing can be rewritten vertically, so that's here, we also know what's the conjugate. Now we're ready to divide. So let's say I'm dividing 1 plus I divided by 2 minus 3i. Now the only thing you're allowed to do in terms of multiplication is multiply by 1. You can multiply by 1 and that's fine. So what we're going to do is multiply by the conjugate of the bottom. So the first step for division, you're going to multiply by the conjugate of the bottom. Not the top, it's really important that it's the bottom. So what's the conjugate of the bottom? That would be 2 plus 3i. Good. Okay, so we're multiplying by the conjugate of the bottom. Now here's where multiplication is going to come into play. You got to multiply all this out. Now it looks like a lot, but it's really not that bad. So let's look at the numerator. So everything that's up top. Distribute your 1, then distribute your I. Or foiling it, whatever you like to do. So if I distribute that 1, I get 2 plus 3i. Distribute that I get 2i plus 3i squared. Good, now look at the bottom. If you want to pause this and try to work out the bottom on your own, definitely do that. If I multiply or FOIL out on the bottom, I get 4 plus 6i minus 6i minus 9i squared. So we've multiplied everything out. Now it comes a time when I'm going to simplify a bunch of stuff. So let's start with the top part here. I have a 3i and a 2i. So that's going to give me a 5i. 3i squared. Remember, what is I squared? I squared is negative 1. So really that's just negative 3. I'm going to add it to my 2 and get a negative 1. So where did that come from again? 3i squared is negative 3. Negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. Good. Now come down to the bottom. What do you notice about those two middle terms? They go away. And that's always going to happen. If that doesn't happen, then you've done something wrong. Go back. So what do I get? Well, negative 9i squared, remember I squared is negative 1, so this is really a positive 9 over here, gives me a 13 on the bottom. So that whole thing just simplified to 13. And now let me rewrite this. Negative 1 over 13 plus 5 over 13i. You can do that. You're allowed to divide both terms by 13. All I've done is split that up, and that's allowed. But you can see, we started with, let me put a little box around it here. We started with that. We started with 1 plus I over 2 minus 3i. We did all these manipulations in order to get down to a complex number, something plus a number times I. And we'll do another one of these. Let's say that I want to do 2 plus 4i divided by 3 minus 2i. So remember the goal. The goal is to get something plus something times I. And these might be, these two a and b, that might be fractions, but it's something plus something times I, or minus, doesn't matter. Well, I'm first going to multiply by the conjugate of the bottom. I'm going to use some parentheses just to keep everything kind of nice. Okay, now on the top, let's multiply this out. So go ahead and pause and try if you want. If I multiply it out, I get 6 plus 4i plus 12i plus 8i squared. On the bottom, I'm going to get 9 plus 6i minus 6i minus 4i squared. Now I'm going to do some simplifying. So on the top, 8i squared is the same as negative 8. So I get negative 2 because of that 6 plus 16i. On the bottom, these two middle terms go away. Negative 4i squared is the same as a plus 4. So I just get 13 on the bottom. So this gives me negative 2 over 13 plus 16 over 13i. And there's going to be my answer. And that is my goal. I got it. I got something plus something times I. Those two somethings weren't very nice. They are fractions, but that's okay. We still got something something plus something times I. Remember, the key here is multiplying by that conjugate of the bottom. Once we do that, we can simplify it. We won't have an I in the bottom anymore. So that's going to be the key.